Hello everyone, welcome to Frightful Whispers. I'm here to guide you into the shadows tonight. I know you're using this video to unwind and drift off to sleep. So, before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you? Now, get cozy, relax, and let the whispers of the night take over. I remember the day we moved into our new home. It was meant to be the start of something fresh, a new chapter for Tom and me. After years of struggling in the city, feeling the constant weight of traffic, noise, and the incessant pressure of modern life, we had decided to leave it all behind. The small cottage we found on the edge of a quiet town seemed like the perfect place to escape, a sanctuary where we could finally breathe. The house, though old and a little worn, had a charm to it. It sat nestled at the edge of a dense, whispering forest, where the trees seemed to tell their stories on the wind. The walls creaked and groaned with history, and the air smelled of pine and dust. It was the kind of place that made you feel like time slowed down, and I liked that. I could finally see us building a life here, one full of peace and quiet. We even talked about starting a family, away from the madness, away from the stress. This would be the place we could call home. But then came the yard sale. Tom and I had spent the morning unpacking, settling into our new space. After a few hours of hauling boxes, Tom suggested we take a break and explore the neighborhood. We were both excited to see what this sleepy little town had to offer, so we walked down the road hand in hand, taking in the sights and sounds of our new surroundings. And that's when we saw it, a yard sale, tucked in the yard of an old house not far from ours. There were knickknacks, books, and little trinkets scattered across the driveway. But one item caught my eye, a doll, sitting there on a rickety table, looking so out of place amidst the jumble of old toys and used furniture. It was a porcelain doll, small, with a pale face, wide eyes that seemed to swallow all the light around them. Its hair was tangled, its dress a faded lace that looked almost too delicate to be touched. But what really unsettled me were those eyes, dark, hollow, like they were staring into you, through you, as though they knew something you didn't. I don't know why, but I felt drawn to it. There was an undeniable pull, a kind of curiosity I couldn't shake off. I told myself it was just a doll, just an old thing. But the more I looked at it, the more I felt something wasn't right. Tom noticed me standing there, staring at it. "What do you think?" he asked, always so much more practical than me. "It's perfect for the living room, right?" I hesitated for just a moment before nodding. "Yeah, I think it could fit right in." The seller, an older woman, saw us eyeing the doll. She seemed eager to part with it. "That one's only $5, she said, almost too quickly. "You might want to take it off my hands. It's not for everyone, you know?" I was taken aback by her tone, but I didn't think much of it at the time. People are strange, I told myself. But when I glanced back at the doll, its eyes still locked on mine, I couldn't help but feel a shiver crawl up my spine. Tom, ever the optimist, didn't think twice. He handed over the money, and we walked away with the doll in hand. It wasn't heavy, but it felt wrong somehow. Like a weight I couldn't quite carry, but I ignored the feeling. It was just a doll, right? We brought it back to the cottage and placed it on the mantel in the living room. For the first few days, it was easy to dismiss the odd sense of unease I felt when I looked at it. The house was new, full of strange sounds, and we were still getting used to the quiet. But as the days went by, something began to change. The house, our home, felt different. I started noticing things out of place. A chair moved just slightly. A book left on the coffee table was on the floor when I came back into the room. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. Old houses creak and shift, things get moved without you realizing it. But that didn't explain the feeling I had, the feeling of being watched, of the doll's eyes following me around the room, always just a little too aware. That night, after a long day of unpacking, we sat down to relax. The fire crackled in the hearth, and we had settled into a comfortable silence, the warmth of the room contrasting with the cool air outside. But as I sat there, something gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the doll, sitting on the mantel, wasn't just a doll anymore. It was alive, watching me, watching us. I turned to Tom, trying to push the uneasy thoughts from my mind. Do you ever get the feeling that something's wrong? Tom looked at me, confused. What do you mean? With the doll, I whispered, my voice low, barely above a breath. I don't know, Tom. I keep feeling like it's watching me. He laughed lightly, as he always did when I got caught up in something that seemed irrational to him. It's just a doll, Linda. There's nothing to worry about. But I couldn't ignore it. Every time I looked at it, it felt like those black eyes were following me. The longer I stayed in the room, the more intense the feeling became. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that it was nothing, just a silly reaction to an old, worn-out object. But that night, as we went to bed, something changed. I could hear it, the faintest tapping sound, like tiny fingers drumming on the floor. I froze, listening. It was subtle, almost like it was coming from the other room. My heart beat faster in my chest, and I nudged Tom awake. "What's that sound?" I asked, my voice shaking. Tom opened his eyes, groggy and confused. "What sound?" I pointed toward the door, my voice barely a whisper. "The tapping, you don't hear that?" But by the time Tom sat up, the tapping had stopped. The room felt cold. I tried to shake it off, to convince myself it was just the house settling, the wind outside. But the silence that followed was thick and suffocating. I stared at the doll on the mantel, its eyes now darker than before. It felt like it was waiting, watching. It wasn't just a doll anymore, it was something more. I thought I was just tired, adjusting to the new house. At first, everything felt so quiet, so peaceful. It was everything Tom and I had hoped for, a fresh start. But as the days wore on, something began to feel wrong. It wasn't immediately obvious, just little things. A chair moved when I was certain I hadn't touched it. Books would end up on the floor, as if knocked over by an invisible hand. I told myself it was the house settling, the natural creaks of old walls and floors. But the feeling didn't go away. It started in the evenings. That's when it was the worst. When the sun dipped below the trees, casting long shadows across the room, that's when it started. The room grew colder. The doll, sitting innocently on the mantel, felt heavier. It wasn't the weight of porcelain or the thickness of the dust, it was something deeper. A presence. Something that wasn't supposed to be there. Something watching me. I would look at it, at its wide, empty eyes, and feel a strange shiver crawl down my spine. I didn't want to believe it, but every time I turned away, I could feel it. Its eyes following me, tracking my every movement. I tried to brush it off, told myself I was being ridiculous. But the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger the feeling became. One night, after a long day of unpacking, Tom and I sat down on the couch, both of us exhausted from the effort. The house had a strange quietness to it, the kind that made everything feel just a little too still. The fire crackled in the hearth, the flames casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Tom hummed a soft tune while stirring something on the stove. I tried to focus on the mundane, on the comfort of the moment. But no matter where I looked, my gaze kept drifting to the mantel, to that damned doll. I swear to God it felt like it was watching me. I couldn't take my eyes off of it, and the more I stared, the more those dark eyes seemed to pull me in. I shifted in my seat, uneasy, and when I finally tore my gaze away to look at Tom, I felt an inexplicable weight on my chest. He didn't notice, of course. Tom was always so grounded, so practical. He didn't believe in things like this, things I couldn't explain. When I told him about my unease, he just laughed it off. "Linda, it's just a doll," he said, shaking his head with a smile. "You're overthinking it." Maybe I was, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, even as we ate dinner, even as we sat together laughing, trying to enjoy our new life. It was always there, just beneath the surface. That night, everything changed. I woke up in the dark, my body drenched in sweat. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, trying to shake off the heavy weight of the nightmare that still clung to me. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I turned to look at Tom, who was sleeping peacefully beside me. For a moment, I felt relieved. This was just a nightmare, just a bad dream. But then I heard it. A soft tapping. It started faint, almost like a distant drumbeat echoing from the living room. I froze, straining to hear. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was deliberate, almost too rhythmic to be a random noise. I turned to Tom, shaking him awake. "Tom, do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He stirred, but didn't open his eyes. "What are you talking about?" The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I could feel the weight of it pressing against me. Something was wrong. Something was so terribly wrong. My heart was in my throat as I slowly slid out of bed, trying to make as little noise as possible. I crept to the doorway and peered into the living room. The faint light from the hallway illuminated the space just enough for me to see the mantel, where the doll sat, as it always did. But something was different. The doll's eyes. They weren't where they should be. They were looking straight at me, watching, waiting. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I backed away, my breath caught in my throat. The tapping stopped, but the room was colder than ever, the air thick with a presence I couldn't explain. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation, but there was none. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned back to Tom, shaking him harder. "Tom, wake up! Something's happening." He opened his eyes, confused, but I could see the grogginess in them. "Linda, what's wrong? What are you talking about? Do you hear that? Do you feel it?" I could barely get the words out. "The doll, it's alive." Tom sat up, rubbing his eyes. "Linda, you're just tired. It's nothing. Go back to bed." I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, my body trembling with a fear I couldn't explain. I wanted to believe him. I tried to, but I couldn't. The doll, it was watching me, and the presence in the room, it was growing stronger. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was worse. The kind of silence that settles deep in your bones, filling every corner of the room with something other than peace. It was then I realized I wasn't alone. I hadn't been for a while. Something in that house, in that doll, was awake now, and it was waiting for me. It wasn't just the coldness that was beginning to seep into the walls of the house. It was something worse, something that wrapped around my chest like a vice, squeezing the breath out of me. The longer the doll sat there, staring with those black, hollow eyes, the more I felt it. The weight in the air, the suffocating silence, the feeling of being watched even when I knew I was alone. I was out in the garden one morning, trying to distract myself from the gnawing dread that had become my constant companion. The sun was low, the day crisp with early spring air. I was pulling weeds from the flower bed, not really focusing on the task, just letting my hands move as I tried to shake off the sense that something was waiting for me to acknowledge it, to give in to it. That's when I saw her, Mrs. Barlow. She stood at the edge of her fence, her hands wrapped tightly around her shawl. Her eyes, sharp, piercing, were fixed on me, her small frame barely moving, as if she were a statue watching from the shadows. She had always been strange, the kind of woman who kept to herself. We'd exchanged pleasantries a few times since we moved in, but she never lingered. There was something in her that felt off. Maybe it was her age, or the way her voice always seemed to tremble with an unspoken truth, but it was something I could never quite place. And today, as she stared at me from across the fence, I knew this wasn't a casual hello. She knew something. "You have it, don't you?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "Have what?" I asked, wiping my hands on my jeans, feeling my stomach knot in confusion. She tilted her head toward the house, her eyes following my gaze, and then her voice dropped, the words barely audible above the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. "The doll," she said, her eyes narrowing, as if she were trying to gauge whether I understood. I froze, my pulse racing. "The doll?" She nodded. "I saw you buy it at the yard sale." I felt my chest tighten. There was no way she could have known. But I had brought it home, placed it on the mantel, tried to ignore the way it made me feel. I didn't know why I had bought it. It had felt wrong from the start. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just an innocent object. And now, Mrs. Barlow's gaze confirmed it. She knew. "Why are you looking at me like that?" I asked, trying to mask my unease with a shaky laugh. "It's just a doll. It's no big deal." But Mrs. Barlow didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. She took a step closer, her hands trembling as she pulled the edges of her shawl tighter around her frail shoulders. Her eyes met mine with such intensity that I felt a cold shiver ripple down my spine. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of a truth I didn't want to hear. "That doll is not just a doll, it's a vessel." I blinked, unable to comprehend her words. "A vessel?" I repeated, my mind racing to find an explanation, to dismiss her warnings as the ramblings of an old woman. But her eyes told me she wasn't lying, she wasn't joking. "Yes, a vessel, for a spirit," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper as if speaking louder might make it real. "A spirit of a child, a little girl named Evelyn." I laughed, though it was forced. "Come on, Mrs. Barlow, a spirit? You're telling me the doll's haunted?" Her expression remained grim. "Haunted? No, it's not just haunted, it's cursed. That little girl's spirit was trapped inside that doll, and she's not innocent anymore. The grief, the anger, it changed her. She's no longer just a child, she's something else." My skin prickled, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The weight in the air grew heavier, thicker, like something was pressing down on me. "What do you mean, changed? How did it get inside the doll?" Mrs. Barlow looked down, her voice softening with a tinge of sorrow. "Her mother. Evelyn's mother tried to bring her back, tried to use dark rituals to raise her from the dead. But it went wrong. She failed. And when she did, she didn't just let her daughter's spirit go. She trapped it in that doll, a toy, a prison." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. I had thought the doll felt wrong, but this was something else. "You're telling me it's evil?" My voice shook, a cold sweat forming on my brow. Mrs. Barlow nodded, her eyes dark. "It's not just evil, it's powerful, The more it's ignored, the more it grows. The longer it's left alone, the stronger the spirit becomes. It feeds on neglect. It feeds on the fear of those who bring it into their homes. And the more you ignore it, the more it demands. My breath hitched. What happens when it demands? She didn't need to answer. Her expression said it all. People vanish, she whispered. Families, they vanish. The last ones who had it, they disappeared, gone, just like that. She snapped her fingers, the sound sharp in the silence of the yard. I took a step back, the ground suddenly feeling unstable beneath my feet. My eyes darted to the house, to the living room where the doll sat innocently on the mantel, waiting. I could feel it, the weight of its gaze, as though it were listening, watching. I turned back to Mrs. Barlow, my voice barely a whisper. "What can I do? How do I stop it?" She shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "It's too late. You've already taken it in. You've already invited it in. You can't just get rid of it. The more you try, the more it will fight back. It will never leave you." The chill that had settled over me seemed to deepen. My hands trembled as I reached for the small piece of paper she handed me. It was old, weathered, the edges curled and stained. "This is the name of the family who had it before you," she said quietly. "The last ones. Maybe you'll learn something from their mistakes. But I warn you, child, you won't be able to escape it. You're already caught in its grip." I stood there, frozen, holding the paper as Mrs. Barlow slowly turned to walk away, her footsteps soft against the earth. I wanted to call after her, to ask more questions, but I couldn't move. The weight of her words, the gravity of what she had said had paralyzed me. When I finally turned back toward the house, the doll was still there, on the mantel, eyes wide, watching, and I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that it was waiting for me, waiting for all of us. Something was wrong. I could feel it in my bones, deep in the marrow of my body, an undeniable weight pressing down on me, suffocating me with every breath. It wasn't just the coldness that seemed to settle into the walls, or the occasional creaks and groans of the house. It was something more, something that I couldn't explain. A presence, watching, waiting. At first, I dismissed it. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was all in my head. But the longer I stayed in the house, the more it became impossible to ignore. There was something wrong with the air itself, like it was thicker, denser, pulling the life out of the room. It wasn't the house settling, wasn't just the sound of an old place adjusting. No, it was something else entirely. I tried to pretend it wasn't there. I did. I kept myself busy with the small tasks, arranging books, unpacking boxes, finding places for the dishes. But no matter what I did, I felt it. That thing on the mantel, watching me, the doll. Every time I passed it, I could feel its eyes on me. Those dark, glassy orbs following my every movement. I told myself it was my imagination, that it was just a doll, after all. But the longer I stayed in this house, the more I felt its weight, its presence. It wasn't just an object, it was alive. That night, after a long day of unpacking, I found myself sitting in the living room alone. Tom was in the kitchen, humming softly as he washed the dishes. It was peaceful, quiet. I should have been content. And yet, I wasn't. The air felt thick, like a storm was coming, and the tension in my chest refused to ease. I tried to focus on the book in my lap, but my eyes kept drifting to the mantel where the doll sat, still as ever. And then I heard it. At first it was faint, a soft, rhythmic tapping. I thought I imagined it, dismissed it as the house settling. But no, it was there again, tap, tap, tap. My heart skipped a beat. The sound was coming from the direction of the mantel. No, it couldn't be. I was imagining it. It had to be. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the words in my book, but my pulse was thumping in my ears. The tapping continued, slow and steady, like tiny fingers tapping against wood. I couldn't stop myself. I slowly set the book down and turned my head toward the mantel. The doll, was it moving? It couldn't have been. I was too tired, too anxious. I needed rest. But the tapping, it grew louder, more insistent. I stood up, slowly, my legs heavy with dread. The room felt colder, the temperature dropping in an instant. I could see my breath in the air, clouding in front of me as I stepped toward the mantel. The doll. There it was, sitting perfectly still. But the tapping, it was coming from within it. I could feel the vibrations, hear the pulse. The sound was louder now, unmistakable. Tap, tap, tap. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped closer, my eyes glued to the doll, unable to look away. And then, something happened. The doll's head, it tilted, just slightly. I gasped, stumbling back. My pulse raced, my legs refused to move. The doll had never moved before, not like this. Its eyes, those cold, lifeless eyes, were now fixed directly on me, staring, watching. I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing against my chest, the air thick with something dark. I looked away, trying to shake the dizziness from my head. The tapping. It stopped. But something else lingered, something worse. The silence in the room felt like it was holding its breath. Tom. I finally managed to gasp, my voice shaking. Tom, come here, now. He appeared in the doorway, his expression one of confusion. Linda, what's wrong? I grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the mantel. My heart was pounding so loudly in my ears that I could hardly hear myself speak. Look at it. Look at the doll. Tom's eyes followed mine, but there was no recognition in his gaze. He blinked at the doll, then at me. What about it? It moved, I almost screamed, but my voice came out as a strained whisper, barely a sound. It's alive. Look at its eyes, Tom. It moved. Tom furrowed his brow, clearly trying to make sense of what I was saying. Linda, you're not making sense. It's just a doll. There's nothing wrong with it. But I could feel it. I could feel the truth in my bones, in the way the air had shifted, in the way the room felt suddenly colder. The doll, that thing, was alive, and it had noticed me. Before I could say anything more, I heard it again, the tapping. Soft at first, then louder, tap, tap, tap. The rhythm wasn't random, it was deliberate. It was the sound of something, someone calling to me. I whipped around, my heart nearly bursting from my chest. The tapping came from the hallway just beyond the living room. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I turned back to Tom, my voice barely above a whisper. Do you hear that? Tom blinked, clearly still confused. What are you talking about? I stared down the hallway, my body tense, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. The shadows. They were moving. I could see them, stretching across the floor, creeping along the walls. They were alive. Tom, I whispered again, my voice trembling. Something's here, something's wrong. He looked toward the hallway, his expression still one of disbelief. Linda, you're scaring yourself. It's just the house settling. No, I screamed, cutting him off. No, Tom, it's not the house. There's something here. It's inside the house. It's in the doll. He looked at me, but I could see the doubt in his eyes, the skepticism, the disbelief. He couldn't feel it. He didn't see what I saw, and that made it worse. That made me feel so alone. The tapping, it didn't stop. It was louder now, closer. I could feel it coming from behind me, moving down the hallway, approaching. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, the shadow. A figure, moving. My body went numb, my breath a sharp, ragged gasp. The room, no, the house, was no longer just a place. It was something alive, something hunting. The doll had begun it. And now it was too late. I don't know how to explain what happened that night. It was like the house itself decided to come alive, to take me with it into the dark place where the shadows live. The first thing I noticed was the change in the air. It thickened, like it was pressing down on my chest, suffocating me. The room felt colder, so much colder than it had ever been. I could feel it in my bones, the icy fingers of dread creeping beneath my skin. I thought I was imagining it. I tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid, but no. It wasn't just my mind playing tricks. Something was wrong. Something was waking up. Tom stood in the doorway, staring at me with wide eyes, confused, but I couldn't focus on him anymore. The room, no, the whole house, it felt like it was holding its breath. The walls seemed to shift in the corners of my vision, warping, bending, as though the house itself was coming to life. I turned to the mantel where the doll sat. The same doll that had been tormenting me for days. Its eyes. Those dark, empty eyes, they were staring right at me. The air grew thicker, heavier. It felt like the space around me was closing in, tightening around my chest. I reached for Tom, my hand trembling, but he didn't move. His feet were rooted to the floor, his face pale, his eyes glazed over. I called his name, but it was like he couldn't hear me, or worse, he wouldn't. He just stood there, frozen in place, as though the doll had already claimed him. That's when I heard it. The faintest sound, barely audible, but unmistakable. A tap, tap, tap. Like someone was knocking on the door, but there was no one there. I turned, my heart thudding in my chest, and my eyes snapped back to the doll. The sound was coming from it. Tap, tap, tap. The tapping wasn't coming from the floor. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside the doll. I couldn't breathe. My vision began to swim, a dizzying blackness clouding the edges of my sight. I took a step back, my legs unsteady. The cold, the tapping, the overwhelming pressure, I couldn't take it anymore. The shadows on the wall seemed to stretch, to move, to reach toward me. My skin crawled. "Tom," I shouted again, but my voice felt weak. It felt far away, like I was watching myself from the outside. "Tom, move." But he didn't move. The tapping grew louder. It was a steady rhythm now, almost like a heartbeat. I could feel it in my chest, reverberating through my bones, until it felt like my very soul was in sync with it. The doll's eyes never left me. It didn't blink, it didn't shift, but I could feel it. I could feel its gaze piercing me. I could feel it pulling me in. Suddenly, the sound stopped, and then, just as I thought I might collapse from the tension, the doll's head moved. Slowly, so slowly that I thought I was imagining it at first. Its porcelain face tilted toward me, a fraction of an inch at a time. My heart froze. It was looking at me. I could feel it, its presence. It was in my head. I could hear it, the softest whisper, as though it was calling to me from within the doll's broken mouth. But the voice wasn't a child's anymore. It was dark, twisted, hollow. "Help me," it said. The words were like a knife, cutting through the room, through my thoughts. My blood ran cold. I stumbled backward, my breath hitching in my throat. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to feel it. But the room was closing in on me, the shadows pulling tighter, wrapping around me, suffocating me. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath in front of me, like I was standing in a snowstorm. "Tom, please," I screamed, my voice cracking. But he didn't move. He was gone. His eyes were empty. He wasn't Tom anymore. He was just a shell, a body controlled by something far darker than I could comprehend. The tapping started again, this time louder, faster, as if the doll was impatient. But this time, it wasn't just the doll that moved. The shadows in the corners of the room twisted, becoming more solid, more real. They stretched toward me, their fingers reaching for my skin. I felt them, cold and thin, like fingers made of ice. They touched me. I screamed, but no sound came out. My throat was raw, tight, suffocating. The shadows were dragging me toward the doll, toward the mantel, toward the black hole of darkness that seemed to be growing within the doll's eyes. The closer I got, the more I felt the walls close in on me, like I was being pulled into some other world. The air was thick with something terrible, something I couldn't even begin to understand. And then it spoke again. "Help me. Help me. Help me." The voice was different now. It was no longer a single voice. It was a chorus. 1,000 voices, all speaking at once. I could feel them in my head, drowning me, suffocating me, pulling me deeper and deeper into their torment. "You are mine now." The words were like a black mist wrapping around my mind, suffocating every thought, every scream, until I couldn't fight it anymore. The shadows wrapped tighter around me, and the last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the doll's eyes, watching, waiting, and then everything went black. I can't remember how long I've been in this place, this house. It feels like time has stopped, like I'm trapped in a moment that keeps repeating itself over and over. But the truth is, I can feel it now. The house, the air, the shadows, they're all alive. The doll, the thing I thought was just some innocent relic from a yard sale, is not just a doll, it's everything. The weight of it presses down on me. The walls feel too close, too tight. I'm suffocating in here. Every step I take, the floor creaks, the shadows grow thicker, the air colder. The doll, it's watching me, it's always watching me, even when I'm not looking. I can feel its eyes on me, like icy fingers wrapped around my throat. I can't escape it. When I woke up on the floor, I didn't know where I was at first. I didn't even know if I was still me. My body ached, my head spun, and when I tried to move, it felt like my limbs were made of stone. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, suffocating, pulling me down, forcing me deeper into this nightmare. And then I heard it. That sound, the tapping. It was soft at first, just barely a whisper in the back of my mind. But as I opened my eyes and struggled to sit up, it grew louder. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the mantel. I didn't need to look to know what it was. The doll. I tried to get up, tried to force myself to stand, but my legs wouldn't obey. The shadows in the room moved with me, curling around my feet, like they were waiting for me to fall. I felt like I was being dragged down, like the darkness was pulling me closer to the source of it all. The doll. I reached for Tom. I had to. I needed him to see what was happening, to feel it. But he didn't move. His eyes were blank, vacant, his body stiff and unyielding. He was there, but he wasn't. He was already gone. My voice came out in a hoarse whisper. "Tom, please, please look at me. You have to see what's happening. You have to fight it." But he didn't hear me. He didn't even blink. And that's when I knew. It had already taken him. The doll, that thing, had claimed him. I could see it now, the way his eyes were fixed on the mantel, on the doll, the way his body was stiff and unmoving. He wasn't Tom anymore. He was just a vessel, a puppet. And the thing inside the doll had control. I could feel it in the air, in my skin, in my soul. The thing was coming for me too, the tapping. It had stopped. The room was silent, and then suddenly I heard it, the voice. The same voice I'd heard in my dreams, in my nightmares, echoing in my head. help me. I didn't know if it was real or if I was losing my mind. The words were sweet, almost innocent, like a child begging for help. But there was something twisted in them, something wrong. The voice wasn't coming from the doll. It was coming from within it. It was coming from everywhere. Help me, help me, help me. And then the doll's mouth opened. At first, it was just a small crack, like porcelain splitting under pressure, but it kept stretching and stretching, until the mouth was wide, impossibly wide, like it was being torn apart. The eyes didn't move, but the mouth was wide, and inside there was something. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Something was coming. My breath caught in my throat as I watched, helpless, as the doll's form started to change. The cracks spread across its face, jagged lines that looked like scars. It wasn't a doll anymore, it was something else. Something alive. "You are mine now," the voice boomed, no longer a whisper but a roar that shook the house to its core. The shadows writhed, and I felt myself being pulled toward it, toward the thing inside the doll. I tried to fight it, tried to pull back, but I couldn't. My body was no longer mine to command. The doll's face split open, its eyes widened, its mouth stretched impossibly wide, like it was consuming the very air around me. The room twisted, warped, the walls stretching and distorting, becoming something grotesque. I couldn't breathe, I couldn't move. I could only feel the pull, the unrelenting force dragging me closer, dragging me toward the thing that had taken Tom. I reached out for him. "Tom, please." My voice was barely a whisper, lost in the roar of the thing inside the doll, but it was no use. Tom was gone. The doll had him. It had claimed him. It was going to claim me, too. I felt it then, the cold, so cold it burned. It wrapped around me, through me like ice in my veins. The shadows closed in and I could hear them now. Voices. 1,000 voices, 1,000 whispers all speaking at once. I couldn't understand them, they were too many, but I could feel them, their pain, their agony, their rage. The house was alive now. It was alive with the voices of the lost, the souls trapped in the doll, and I was one of them. The last thing I remember was the doll's eyes, wide, hollow, empty. But as I reached out to it, I knew. It wasn't just looking at me, it was taking me, it was pulling me in, and I was powerless to stop it. I can still see them, those eyes. Even now, as I sit here, if this is even sitting anymore, if I can even call it that, I can still see them. They haunt me, no matter where I go. They are always there, staring, watching, waiting. I didn't understand it at first. I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a product of fear, or the darkness in the house creeping into my thoughts. But now, I know. I know the truth. The doll's eyes, they're not just eyes, they're alive. I don't know when it happened. Maybe it was when I first saw them, the way they gleamed, cold and unblinking, always watching. At first, I dismissed it. I told myself it was nothing, it was just a doll. But every time I walked past it, I felt them. Those eyes, cold and empty, following my every move. I'd tell myself, it's nothing. It's just my imagination. But every time I looked away, I could feel them still on me. It wasn't just a feeling anymore, it was a presence. The house started to feel smaller. The walls seemed to close in on me, the air heavy and oppressive. I couldn't breathe without feeling the weight of something, someone, pressing in on me. I started to feel watched all the time. When I tried to sleep, I could feel it. The gaze from across the room, its stare unblinking. When I woke in the middle of the night, I would turn, my eyes instinctively darting to the mantel, and I'd see it. Those eyes always waiting. I couldn't shake it. The doll was inanimate, but those eyes were alive, alive with something I didn't understand. Something ancient, something evil. And the worst part, it was getting stronger. I could feel it. The air was thicker now, colder. The shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching and twisting, growing longer every time I looked away. But that night it was different. The stillness that had taken over the house was shattered by a whisper. Software low. A breath against my ear, barely audible. "Help me." The voice was a child's voice, or at least it sounded like one. But it wasn't innocent. There was something wrong with it. A jaggedness, a malice beneath its sweetness. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest, my breath shallow. It wasn't real. I couldn't let it be real. But then the voice came again. "Help me, help me." This time, I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't deny it. My body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I couldn't move. The doll was alive. It was calling to me. But not in the way you think, not like a child lost and looking for help. No, it was commanding me. It was pulling me closer, pulling me into that void inside it. I had to face it. I had to. Slowly, I turned toward the mantel, toward the doll. The room seemed to tilt. The walls stretched out, as though they were trying to keep me away, to pull me back. But my feet were moving on their own. Slowly, I walked toward it, my legs heavy, like I was wading through water. The doll's eyes were locked on me. They were so black, so dark I thought I might drown in them, and then I saw it. It moved. I swear to God it moved. The head tilted. Just a little at first, then more. Slowly, deliberately, as though it were waking up. The porcelain face cracked, like a crack in the ice, lines spidering across its surface. The eyes, those eyes, they didn't just stare at me anymore. They followed me. They weren't just seeing me, they were taking me. And that's when I heard it. The voice again, louder now. It wasn't a child's voice anymore. It was something darker, something older. "You are mine now." The words reverberated through me, through my soul, like an echo that tore through my very existence. And as the voice echoed, the air grew colder, the shadows swirling faster, pulling at me, swallowing the light in the room. My heart pounded, my breath shallow. The doll was no longer just a doll. It was something else. It was alive. It was a thing born of suffering, of rage, of something ancient and twisted. It was feeding off of me, off of my fear, off of every part of me that still clung to life. The more I resisted, the stronger it grew. I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the floor, my body frozen in place. The doll's eyes were still on me, its smile stretching impossibly wide, like it was pulling me into its abyss. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I wanted to run, but my body refused to move. The darkness surrounded me, engulfing me in its cold, suffocating grip. "You are mine now." The words came again, louder this time, powerful, a demand that rang in my ears. The room spun, the shadows closing in on me, the doll's eyes expanding until they were all I could see. Its face stretched, contorted, the porcelain cracking, splintering like it was being torn apart from the inside. The mouth opened wider and wider until it couldn't possibly be real. Its smile, a smile that was no longer innocent, no longer childlike, split its face in half. I couldn't look away. I couldn't move. And then, the air shifted. It felt like a flood, like the very walls of the house were collapsing inward, the darkness flooding me. I could feel the cold spreading through my chest, through my veins, numbing me. The thing inside the doll wasn't just watching. It wasn't just taking. It was consuming me, piece by piece, like it had done to Tom, like it had done to every soul before me. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the doll's eyes, and they were still watching. Thank you for venturing into the shadows with me here at Frightful Whispers. Remember, the darkness holds secrets, but also whispers truths to those who dare to listen. If tonight's tale sent shivers down your spine, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep the fire of fright alive. Rest easy, but keep one eye open, for the night is never truly still. Until we meet again, stay vigilant, stay curious, and let the whispers guide you.